Well, welcome everyone to the first sort of discussion session here. And we've been given quite a broad topic to speak about. What has been learned about the key issues and development impact of private sector investments, including development results, sustainability, and potential trade-offs. And I was really excited to see that top. My name is Sean Turnbull. I'm from Global Affairs Canada. I'm the impact lead on the new tranche of blended finance money that Global Affairs is starting to disperse. So this question of development impact and what we've learned to date is really important to us as a department. And as we started digging into it, I think what we've found is an industry that isn't, I don't think we can say nascent anymore. It's maybe entering its sort of troublesome teenage years, and a mix sort of where we have strong evidence and maybe not as strong evidence. And so the evidence of impact, the quality of that evidence, and how those things interact with the financial side of the house, where we are always in discussions with the mix of return on finance and the mix of return on development. All of these sort of issues are swirling around in my brain as we try and set up this money at Global Affairs Canada. So I was excited to moderate this panel. And I've been told to keep this very short, so I'm going to do a complete disservice and just tell you the names of the people. And I was told that they can look up your bios on the website. So apologies in advance, but I believe we have everyone here. So I'll go through the speakers, and this is also going to be the order we're going to go through. So first we'll give 5 minutes to everyone to give a high-level overview of their sort of thoughts on all those issues. Then we'll have a discussion between the panelists, and hopefully please type some questions into the chat box so that we can start putting your questions from the audience to these great people here. So quickly then, we have Howard White, the Executive Director of the Campbell Collaboration, Elani Yabarek, Senior Lecturer at University of Pretoria and a GDN EIB Fellow. I believe we have Emmanuel Jimenez, if he's here, if you can turn on his video, the Senior Fellow and former Director of 3IE. We have Kelly McCarthy, the Director of Research at GIN. Soren Peter Anderson, there's Manny, thank you. Soren Peter Andresen, CEO and General Manager, European Development Finance Institutions. And finally, Richard M. Moore, Head of Corporate Lending in Africa, Caribbean, Pacific, Asia, and Latin America at EIB. So far too fast, far too brief an introduction, but only to give you all more time to speak to these important issues. And I think we'll just start then with Howard, if you don't mind starting us off with your 5 minute take on these things.
Thank you, Sean, and welcome everybody. So when I was asked to speak at this event, indeed when we've been planning the event with GDN, I've been a bit unsure at times about the focus on whether it's the impact of private sector development investments or more specifically on impact investing. And I'm actually none the wiser from the opening session, but I'm taking it, what I speak mainly applies to both, though some of it does apply more specifically to impact investing, which for those that are not familiar with that distinction, I'll also come back to that. So I'm going to say a few remarks about producing evidence and then a few remarks about using evidence. So first on producing evidence, what I think everybody knows is there's been a massive rise in impact evaluations that estimate the effect of an intervention on health, education outcomes, income, poverty, and so on. Massive rise in those sort of studies over the last going on for 20 years now. There may many organizations have been part of that, Diamond CF at the World Bank, JPAL IPA, 3IE, and so on, have all been major funders of this rise of impact evaluations, including RCTs, but not only RCTs. If you look at the 3IE database, which has around 5,000 impact evaluations over the last 20 years, you'll see, I forget the exact number, but around 50–60% are RCTs. But what you also notice, if you look at the 3IE database, is that the predominant focus actually is on the health sector, and then it's on education, and these are predominantly in public sector investments. So the bulk of impact evaluation is relating to public sector investments, not to private sector investments. And people might then say, oh, well, the private sector is different because of the modalities, the way in which the private sector works. It's not possible to do impact evaluation in the private sector. Of any sort of involvement, any sort of investment you have which has private sector engagement, it's not going to be possible to do an impact evaluation. If you look at the developed world, you have exactly the opposite. You have far more RCTs being done in the private sector than you have in the public sector. So if you look at leading firms, they can be technology firms like Microsoft or Google, but they can be retailers like leading supermarkets. You're exposed, living in a developed country, to at least a dozen RCTs a day and you don't know it. Because every time you go to a supermarket, they're exposing you to RCTs in terms of pricing, layout of the supermarket, different things they do, just offering smells through the supermarket, different things they try to get you to buy more stuff. Yes, so RCTs are embedded into private sector life in the developed world, and there's no reason why that shouldn't be the case in the developing world. The difference, of course, is developed country RCTs are primarily to get you to buy more stuff, to serve the bottom line, not to make people healthier, less poverty, and so on. But that also is changing because everybody wants to be woke these days, and the most woke thing you can do is demonstrate the social impact of what you do. And so it's actually quite an easy sell to go to a private sector investor and say, we can demonstrate your wokeness by measuring the impact of the social impact of your interventions or your investments, interventions. So I think there's great scope for doing it. So finally, just a couple of points on producing. One is if you're going to do an impact evaluation, of course, you need to plan for it. And there's a couple of ways you need to plan for it, which is to think what outcomes you're interested in up front. And so if you want to measure impact on employment or poverty or on health and education, you need to plan on that and collect adequate data at baseline in both treatment and comparison areas. And so I'm not going to talk about designs and so on, but maybe someone else will. So you need to be doing that. But the second thing is, of course, you need to fund it. And I think that is an issue because the funding for the evaluation is separate to the funding for the investment. And the private sector investor has to be convinced there's value in that. Now, when 3IE was set up, the intention that CGD had in proposing 3IE was to be a levy on all development agencies, 0.5% of that was suggested, on their spend to pay into a global fund for doing impact evaluations across development programs. That didn't happen, unfortunately, so 3I is not as well funded as one would like. But you could think of a similar model specifically for private sector investments, specifically even for impact investing. So any impact investment doesn't just fund any impact evaluation it might want to do. There's a levy on that to pay into a global impact investment evaluation fund that then goes out and does evaluations of particular sorts that are of interest to the community. And that then comes into my second set of points around using evidence. So having myself moved from 3I to Campbell, but also because I believe in it, you don't want to rely on single studies to know what works. So partly because what works in one place will not necessarily work in another place, but because there's noise going on in individual interventions and so on, it's much better to learn from the global body of evidence that exists around a particular intervention rather than just looking at one study. So this is best developed in the health sector, where it's been institutionalized. So it's best institutionalized in the World Health Organization, that produces international guidelines on how to do different health interventions, and then countries around the world use WHO guidelines to inform their national guidelines. And WHO has guidelines on producing guidelines, and they say you have to base your guidelines on high quality systematic reviews. So that's the answer. We want to know what works and what doesn't work, what looks promising, look at systematic review evidence. And of course, Campbell Collaboration is a global library of systematic reviews of what works in different settings and so on. And a good review will tell you contextual factors, heterogeneity, where it works here, doesn't work there, and so on. Well, so it's coming specifically to impact investing. I think impact investors particularly want to know what is it that has a high rate of return, but also does some good. And there's two types of studies you can use to think about that. So one is, well, what the benefits of a particular intervention, and the second is it going to be a profitable investment? And I'm going to use two examples. One is clean water. So clean water is a proven intervention. So clean water and hygiene have proven benefits. The usual outcome measure is child diarrhea. It's a good proxy for health in general, and you get between a 40 to 60% reduction in child diarrhea from having access to clean water. Putting a standpipe in the village, when actually standpipe in the village, no, because it gets contaminated. Putting clean water into the house, or cleaning water at point of use. So filtration, chlorination, and so on. Doing those things has a return. So that's a good thing to do from a health point of view. But studies of willingness to pay show that households are not willing to pay for clean water. They're willing to pay for water because they value the time-saving benefit, but they're not willing to pay for clean water because they don't value the health benefit, they don't perceive the health benefit. So it's good to invest in clean water, but you can't expect to get a financial return from it because people don't value it sufficiently. The willingness to pay is too low. The opposite is the case of rural electrification. Rural electrification has a lot of proven benefits. I did a study on this when I was at the World Bank, so some 15 years ago now, and I think the case for it has only increased because on the cost side, the cost of solar panels, and a lot of what we're looking at solar home systems, cost of providing solar home systems has fallen massively over the last 10 years, and willingness to pay for electrification is huge. People love electricity, and try living in the dark, you soon see why. So people love electricity, willingness to pay is very high, and it has high proven social economic returns. And so you've got an investment there that has both the social benefits, but also the financial benefits. So impact investors ought to have global repositories of information telling them, oh, here's investments that have high social return, here investments that yield a profitable return, and this is so we should put our money in. And currently, as I see it, they're not doing either of those things. They call it impact investing. They're not in any way collectively accumulating these global bodies of evidence going to tell them actually what makes sensible impact investments. We're here at Campbell to help you do that, so you know where we are, give us a call. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Howard, for getting us started off, and really interested, especially on who pays for these things, is something that comes up quite a bit in our discussion. So interested to hear thoughts on that and everything. So we'll turn it over to Alani now.
Thank you very much. I think it would be interesting to start the discussion by highlighting, what would be the role of impact investing for financing development in developing world. And as we know, there is a huge financing gap to achieve the target of SDGs, and the traditional source of development, such as the ODA and the FDI, is declining due to different reasons in many countries. So this implies that we have to find somehow other source of development finance, and this should come from the private sector, which really makes impact investing in a best position to fill in this gap. And interestingly, I think some estimates are showing that the size of impact investing market is actually higher than the ODI of DAC countries, for instance, and its size is growing in contrary to ODI and FDI. So overall, there is a big role that the impact investing can play in development space. But despite this potential in impact investing, there are a number of challenges that really hinder the development of the sector, particularly in playing their role in promoting development in developing countries, I believe. And one of the main challenge is measuring and quantifying the impact in terms of social outcome. As Howard mentioned, there are a number of impact evaluation assessments that use both RCTs and quasi data to measure impact. But if we look at what has been done so far, there is a scant evidence on the role of impact investing in achieving this goal. For instance, there are various methods of measuring impact in the literature, but we don't really have, for instance, a widely accepted framework. For instance, like a gap in accounting space, to measure both the financial return and the social impact of impact investment. There are, of course, attempts that tries to define different methods for addressing causality for impact investment, such as the GIN impact toolkit. But this is really at early stage, and the sector really needs a sound and comprehensive framework in which we can frame, you know, the investment in different sectors, and claim, you know, what has been achieved and why and where, and if not, learn from it and improve the sector while we move forward. And personally, I think that, you know, the second challenge is lack of expertise or capacities in many developing countries. Impact investment, as Howard highlighted before, is not as such any phenomenon. Now it's really becoming popular, and the market is developing. But it is, you know, something new for the financial community in many developing countries, including the regulatory bodies such as, you know, the central banks in many developing countries. So I think if we are interested in building the evidence to promote social impact investment in many poor countries, to achieve, for instance, the target of SDGs, we need to develop some kind of capacity in developing countries, and I believe the lack of capacity in developing countries is really playing its role, and not, you know, in building the knowledge on what really works and why. I also believe that this is really important to upscale all the efforts and to some extent, you know, build confidence of investors to engage more in the sector. And overall, you know, at the current state, it's very difficult to draw, you know, a solid conclusion based on the evidence we have on the exact, you know, role of impact investment in achieving these development targets and what has been achieved so far, and if not, what's not working and why. And I think it's really important to develop a kind of comprehensive framework to evaluate these investments and build the capacity of different actors in the sector, you know, to promote the growth of the sector in general in developing countries. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And yes, that the lack of generally accepted frameworks and rules comes up quite a bit. I think maybe we'll hear a bit from Kelly on that. But first, let's go to Manuel Jimenez, please. Oh, we can't hear you.
Okay, this is better. It helps to turn the microphone on. Okay, thanks a lot, Sean, and thank you again for inviting me to this session. So I wanted to just say two things, and that is, I was reflecting on, one is reflecting on whether defining development impact and measuring it is that different from defining in the private sector, is that different from the public sector? And I think that there are a lot of similarities. Then I'll reflect on what I think are some key differences based on the experience that I had working with Pierre and others, and Eleni, on the GDN EIB program. When I was at the World Bank many years ago, and I'm a public sector guy, I was very intrigued by the huge debates that went on when I was in the evaluation department between the people who were evaluating the IFC and those who were evaluating the World Bank. And there were very different criteria that were supposedly being used to do that. And I often wondered why. In fact, the evaluation department then did an analysis of what are the differences, and it turns out that a lot of it was jargon. That there were differences in jargon, but in effect, the development objectives were really quite similar. The private sector talked about financial sustainability, public sector talked about and firm profitability. And the public sector talked about fiscal implications. The public sector talked about effectiveness of projects, the private sector about the fulfillment of project business objectives. It was just a lot of jargon. So in the end, that seemed to be quite similar. And I want to go back to what both Eleni and Howard also said, that the concern for rigor should also then be similar. I remember an article in the New York Times a few years ago about the state of Utah, which had to pay Goldman Sachs the first of many payments of several $250,000, because Goldman Sachs was the impact investor and had claimed the outcome in terms of decreasing the number of children who were going to special education by attending preschool. And it turns out that when the state of Utah got some academics to look at this, that in fact, yes, the number of kids going to preschool did go down as a result of the program, did go down during the program implementation, but these are kids who would not have gone to preschool anyway. So, but the state of Utah was committed to paying Goldman Sachs a lot of money, despite the fact that they couldn't attribute the outcomes to the intervention. So that's a case in which I would have thought that the investor itself should be really interested in doing really rigorous evaluations of the kind that both Howard and Eleni mentioned, in order to make sure that they were getting the outcomes that they were achieving. Another example in Rajasthan in India, in which UBS provided capital to an education NGO to meet targets regarding learning and access for girls' education. In the first year, they didn't meet the learning targets, but met the access targets. But adjustments were made by the NGO. In the second year, they met both. And that was a win-win, because that was a case in which, as a result of the rigorous evaluation in which there was a control group, they actually found out what to do better. So one thing that a point I wanted to make is that the kinds of issues that are often associated with evaluation in the public sector are very similar to those in terms of development outcomes in the private sector. The last thing I just wanted to say is, what are the differences as I see it? One is that, again, this is based on the experience that Eleni and I had with the evaluations of the investments that GDN had made in the ACP countries, that the returns to these kinds of evaluations are more difficult because the private sector typically doesn't look at control groups. And because they're interested in the investors themselves, I think our researchers found that when they started to evaluate these programs, it was really hard to make that attribution, because the private sector was more interested in the returns to investors rather than the getting used to trying to measure impact overall. The other, and that's been alluded to already by others, is that there are trade-offs. When you do public sector analysis, the economic returns always trump the financial returns when you consider socioeconomic impacts. But it is quite possible that financial returns may be high, where the economic or the socioeconomic returns may not be so high. And that's a real tough one. And that I think I would support what both Howard and Eleni mentioned, to make sure that perhaps there is a third entity that actually funds these evaluations to make sure that they're getting the right impact. So those are just initial thoughts, Sean.
Thank you, and I really like the discussion around talking between the private sector and the public sector and balancing those two things. And I think Kelly and the GIN are trying to solve some of that for us. So we'll throw it over to her now to hear her initial thoughts.
Thanks. And and so I'm going to take a little bit of a different perspective, and just to explain for for those viewing this, I've been with the GIN leading our impact work for nearly a decade at this point, and the GIN has really been looking at this question of how do you integrate impact alongside financial considerations in an effective way to really inform decision making. So that's sort of the hat that I'm wearing with this. And I want to take a bit of a step back, because I think contextualizing, I think what we're seeing happening right now is important. One of I think many of you might know the GIN has a long history of sort of market surveys and really trying to understand and take a pulse of the trends in the market. And one of the things that we're seeing this year in particular is that the sort of leading edge of the market it is really moving, and this discussion is so apropos for that. We're seeing that the need for trusted ways to incorporate impact into decision making has never been greater. And if you just look at, for example, ESG or environmental, social, and governance considerations, just as a step even before thinking about impact, you start to see that folks that have been doing, investors that have been doing, have proven to offer significant advantages to other leading investors around the globe. And one of the things that I start to think about is how that bar has been moving and what's driving that change. So if you think about the focus over the course of, I don't know, several decades, you have a single concept of materiality sort of driving investment decision making. Then you have this concept of ESG issues and doing no harm come to the fore and really start to inform investment. And now we're seeing a very deep interest in creating net positive impact, I'll call it, and we can debate that in a minute. But that's where I think the real sort of leading edge is taking us. And to all the speakers who've said, who've sort of echoed this demand, but obviously the lack of support and resources, we fully see that as well. A couple of data points or things that I just like to share on that front. There's definitely, we're seeing that there's definitely a demand to go beyond what I'll call alignment. So what we've seen for many, many years is the idea that impact from an investment perspective is all about sort of aligning a portfolio to different impact themes. But behind that, to those that have talked about the lack of evidence, but behind that, there's been sort of a dearth of evidence to back up performance against those themes. And I think there's a couple of drivers for why, why the appetite has changed, and I'll get to that in a second. But that appetite has absolutely changed, and we're seeing, sort of a sprint to being able to dig into better data, more robust data, more rigorous, more trusted data about the actual performance against or behind the alignment or thematic investment. One of the things that I think is driving this change, or two of the things that I think are driving this change in this year in particular, is that COVID-19 has obviously produced a lot, sort of exposed a lot of vulnerabilities in the system. And not only the vulnerability side, but also exposed the opportunities to really fundamentally address issues such as health and employment and racial equity. There's two sides of that coin. They're ripe for innovation and actually doing amazing things, and need capital, but also but absolutely need to perform. So that's one. And then the other is, the sort of the role that I sit in. We work a lot with global standard setters and others that are really trying to produce those underpinnings or that infrastructure to support the investment community and the corporate community. And what we're seeing a lot, obviously, coming out of from the regulation perspective, is that regulatory bodies are rapidly starting to include ESG factors into basic disclosure requirements. And so that's also sort of a driver that I think is affecting rapid interest and from my perspective, positive rapid growth in the ability to produce tools that might actually start to close these gaps. And the other is that, and this I think is another positive, but it also starts to drive against that competitive edge discussion. There's really a growing sort of competition amongst asset managers. There's seen is that a lot of major asset managers have sort of clustered around the ESG demand, but what that does is it creates another need of differentiation. So again, what we see here is when you start to think about what does competitive differentiation look like, it's not meeting a baseline. It's actually proving that you can go beyond that baseline and produce returns on top of, optimize for impact or produce returns on top of your basic expectations. So a couple of things I want to share that what we're doing to this end. So I mentioned earlier that we have been working on standards. Many of you might have heard of IRIS Plus for well over a decade, and that work really focused on consolidating metrics, consolidating and creating sort of a or common language for describing impact. IRIS Plus at this point now there's 11,000 folks that are registered users in the system, and many of which are sort of surprising us in terms of the scale of investor in the system. And so that's obviously a positive development, but you need to go beyond, and that's what we're all talking about. So another thing that we're working on and hoping to offer as a public good to the market, we just released this, is a methodology for understanding impact alongside risk, return, and other investment factors. And the sort of key to this methodology, and I'm coming against my time, is around looking at the scale of the problem. So what we think is an interesting addition to a lot of the other work that others are doing in the market is to look at if you were to take sort of an investment theme, an investment sector, for example, and you look at the scale of the problem within that particular theme. So let's just take the scale, and this can be regional, it can be global. The scale of the problem of lack of access to education in Southside Chicago, or lack of access to education in another region in the world. What is the scale of that problem, and can you normalize against that scale and start to actually talk about change, investment change within the context of that dimension? And so that's what we are putting out, and we're finding, to this sort of frame of this discussion, that you can use this type of factor to look at a portfolio of investments, an individual investment. It's sort of a universal way, a universal lens against which to start to understand performance. So I will stop there. I'd love to, Sean, comment on some of the other efforts that are underway, but I'll save it for later.
Great, thank you so much, and it's all very interesting work that you guys are doing. So now we'll shift over to Soren and hear what they're doing over at EDFI on these issues.
Yes, thanks very much, Sean. I hope you hear me okay. And very good to join this panel, this discussion. So I will share some of the sort of an overview of the practice of European development finance institutions in relation to working with impact measurement and data in decision making, and talk a little bit about our experience overall in terms of the linkages between the commercial performance of investments we make and impact effects, and then finally reflect a bit on how this guides us in decision making and how some of the challenges that we have ahead in terms of strengthening practice. So first, it might be interesting or relevant to mention that we have in our group 15 European institutions, and we have a combined portfolio counting around 5,000 individual investments at this time. 1/3 is in sub-Saharan Africa, and the largest sectors are financial services, especially focused on serving SMEs, and then renewable energy and agribusiness. So at the most basic level, DFIs measure key impact contributions of all the enterprises that we invest in, and we measure in all cases or get data from clients on impacts in relation to jobs, gender equality, energy impacts if they are energy producing entities, and climate related impacts, as well as mobilization, which is essentially the private co-finance that goes into the enterprises alongside the DFI's financing, and the domestic resources contributed in terms of tax payments. And so that means, in terms of data and evidence, we have two tracks essentially. One is the data collection from clients, which is like accounting essentially, going alongside the financial accounting data that we get from clients. And then of course there's also extensive work on thematic evaluations, macro studies and so on, although especially when it comes to the macro impacts of the work that DFIs do, I fully concur with some of the earlier observations that this is an important area of investments. So overall, what do we know from this data that we have about DFI's investments and the links between financial performance and development effects? So we know that there is a strong positive correlation between a project's financial outcomes and its development effects. We recently looked at a sample of 500 projects that showed that the majority of projects are in the category of having good financial performance and a good realization of targeted development outcomes. And this stands to reason, because an enterprise that fails commercially also will always struggle to deliver on its impact objectives, whether it's job creation and support, or other measures. We do, of course, see some projects fail in the DFI portfolio, both in terms of commercial performance and development effects. Usually companies that go out of business in the end don't deliver development effects. But it's quite rare in our portfolios that we see companies that are tremendously successful in financial terms, but don't evidence any effects or have negative effects in terms of development outcomes. I think it's clear that DFIs have a big responsibility to really minimize or reduce this category of investments through application of ESG criteria and preventing negative impacts. But when we do look at our portfolios, we see quite a significant category, and this is about a quarter of our investments, that have a good realization of development outcomes, but don't perform well financially during the life or the holding period of the DFI's participation. This can still be a success, especially if you're working in highly inclusive investments in higher risk countries and sectors, where the role of the DFIs is in a sense to be catalytic and carry the enterprise through an early stage of its business plan until it can be financed more in the private sector or by private investors. And so we do have quite a significant experience with these types of investments, and it's part of our portfolio design to be able to do this, even if it's high risk and work intensive. And so that is a conscious part of what we do. So essentially, when you see a DFI designing the portfolio, there's very intensive use of this data on the linkages between financial performance and impact performance. And the decision making we do about designing our portfolio has a range of different targeted impacts, but it also often has a lot of diversification, because you want to blend in these different categories in terms of risks and outcome realization. and you have some very clear trade-offs. So more inclusive projects in higher risk areas tend to have less achievement of mobilization goals. For instance, you have less private participation alongside the DFIs in those, and so you try to mix strategies, investment strategies that are in a sense high risk and those that are high mobilization, and that's the kind of decision making that DFIs use the data to do. Finally, I just want to support Kelly and reinforce the message about where the practice stands today in terms of impact measurement and reporting and the use of this high quality data in decision making. There has been a massive development in this area in the last decade. IRIS Plus is together with the HIPSO initiative for harmonized indicators for private sector operations that works closely with the GIN, and that's a group of DFIs and the multilateral development banks, has reached agreement on harmonized metrics in crucial areas of the key impacts of DFIs. We have a very big job now to promote adoption of standardized metrics. So we as much as possible have much more comparable and much better data to allow us to make even better decisions and compare outcomes between different investment strategies and different investors. And this is something that we want to work on very much and also discuss with all of you. So this is the perspective from the European DFIs, and I look forward to the discussion now. Thanks, Sean.
Great, thank you so much, Soren, and really interesting stuff, especially around sort of taking a portfolio approach to impact. I think is something that is really interesting to a lot of people entering this sector. Okay, last but not least, we'll turn it to Richard.
Thanks very much, Sean, and very happy to round off the first part of these discussions and you know, being on such a fantastic panel. And maybe what I might focus on is maybe 2 or 3 of the lessons that we at the EIB have learned over the last 4 or 5 years as we've implemented this an impact finance envelope of funds that we've received from the European Union member states, and then also perhaps look forward a little bit at some of the trends and some of the things that we're seeing on from an operational side and from a market side of what is coming around the corner. So, okay, looking at lessons learned, maybe the first one is an interesting dynamic that we see on our side as a financial institution is the question of diversification. So from a financial sustainability perspective, obviously diversification across geographies, across sectors, across different types of intervention is welcome. Though what we see from our perception, and my perception is when we're engaging from an impact financing perspective, actually where we've added the most value and where we've been the most impactful is where we've engaged actually in very specific sectors. So what we know best, where we can add the most value. So might be off-grid and sector and the rural electrification sector that Howard mentioned before. It might be on the digitalization side. It might be working alongside venture capital funds, you know, who might not have a strong track record, but we can bring our experience and of these sectors and these types of intervention into the fore, and we can add value there on that side. So, you know, that dynamic of financial sustainability versus where we are really adding value is particularly acute for us that we're seeing from the diversification perspective. Second concrete point I wanted to talk about was actually also what we found has worked well, and it's actually, I'm looking in the chat, and it's a little bit of dealing with one of the questions that we see there from Bart on, you know, bankable businesses. And one of the key lessons that we've learned is where we've seen where we can really add is the support of early stage, very, very young, locally owned, locally managed companies in, you know, immature sectors or those sectors with high growth potential. So this is for us as a financial institution being able to provide kind of debt type structures into pre-bankable businesses, or taking an equity type risk at the very early stages of their development, this is a hugely highly catalytic thing that we're able to do. And this combination of being a key strategic partner earlier on, when a business may not be traditionally bankable, but also and us having that higher risk appetite than we might ordinarily be prepared to take, that combination is extremely valuable. I think the third observation and the lesson that we've learned over the last, I guess, 2 or 3 years is that, you know, that our interventions on this impact finance space is you've got to remain flexible. We've got to remain adaptable, and you've actually, you know, we've got to apply some of these lessons learned to new sectors, to new actors, as market changes and as the global economic conditions changes. And we've seen that very particularly over the last kind of 8 or 9 months of this of the COVID pandemic, because what we've been able to see is these concepts of going in and having a very high risk appetite, supporting, you know, small companies that might not have a long track record, supporting startups, and this type of approach, and using innovative finance structures in new sectors or in sectors that we see where growth is needed. And in particular, we're looking at, for COVID, we're looking at diagnostic devices, you know, the manufacturing and the creation of diagnostic devices for COVID, for TB, for malaria, that traditionally haven't benefited from finance from institutions like us. But if we're applying those lessons and those things that we've seen have worked in rural electrification, have worked in 5G rollout, and applying them into these sectors, it's quite a useful and an impactful thing that we're able to do. I guess then, looking ahead and looking to round up and maybe to start to push a little bit more of the discussion as well, and to give a bit of another jig for the next round of this panel, is, I think, 3 points that we would say is one is that there is, in the market and in the gaps, there is a huge need for this type of investment. So this type of risk appetite. What we see actually is quite a lot of liquidity across the globe for traditional bankable types of operations that don't have impact as the core of their business. So there is a lot of money around. But where you are going down the risk spectrum, where you are having impact and development as a focus, actors like Soren and the European Development Finance Institutions, and actors like ourselves at the EIB, you know, there is a huge need for additional capital to be able to hit those needs. Second point, I would say, again, looking forward over the next 12 to 18 months, is the impact of COVID. So it's been really interesting to see in our existing portfolio, but also talking to people in the markets, is actually what we're seeing is quite a kind of a bifurcated position, right? Is you have markets and sectors that maybe, sectors that are certainly perhaps more mature, and markets that are perceived as perhaps as lower risk or less risky. Investor appetite really remains quite strong and quite good, and we're seeing projects continuing and not being delayed so much. But where we are perceiving a drop-off in that appetite is I guess those countries that are perceived as higher risk, more fragile, and in more less mature sectors. And this here again is going to be, certainly from what our stakeholders are asking us to do, is going to be a key driver, an additional driver for our origination strategies, for our impact finance investing over the next 12 to 18 months. We can certainly guarantee that this is going to be where our stakeholders are expecting us to act. My final point, and it again is a little bit, it's drawing on from what Howard said right actually at the very start of the panel today, about the awareness and the knowledge and the sophistication of counterparts themselves when dealing with this issue when we're out in the market. And our perception is that this is really changed over the last 3 or 4 years, actually quite a lot, and that there is much more awareness amongst our private sector counterparts and our private sector clients of the policy aims and drivers that are important to institutions like the EIB, and again for sovereign and the European Development Finance institutions. They are becoming much more sophisticated and aware of how they describe and how they market their projects to actors like us. So they are upfront becoming much better at describing, impact in terms of SDG indicators, in terms of jobs created, in terms of the social inclusion dimension of a project, or perhaps the positive gender impact of a particular project. And that actually is, I would say, is actually a really positive trend. And it is, as Howard was saying, this is something that people are aware of, and it's in a way it is leaking and reaching into the private sector quite well. And this is not just large global institutions who are trying to do their foreign direct investment across sub-Saharan Africa. This is local actors who have, a development impact at the core of their business model, and they are talking about their businesses in this way. And that actually is making, in some ways, us as a development finance institution, it's really gratifying, and it's making our life actually quite easier and better, because they're much more open to the idea of trying to gather this data and this information for the purposes of measuring the development indicators that we're all looking for. So I will leave it at there. Sean, I think I've kept to my 5 minutes. I'll pass it back over to you, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion. Thanks a lot.
Great, thank you so much, and point taken about needing to be flexible and adaptable, especially from us at Global Affairs, who were trying to launch a blended finance fund in the middle of COVID, and you can only imagine some of the challenges we had with that. So I had some questions of my own, but there's some really good ones in the chat, and what I'll do is sort of combine a couple thematically, because I think they're all sort of a piece. So Sabina had a question for Eleni, so I'll give her the first crack at answering it, but it's really just the big question, which is how do we encourage more private investment in the development sector? And that also speaks to sort of Bart's intervention, which Richard already touched on. Is this a lack of demand side or supply side? Is it a lack of investable businesses? Is it a lack of capital in the right places? As Richard said, there's lots of capital, but there's not the right risk tolerance. So I think this is probably something that weighs on a lot of people's minds, is how do we go from the billions to trillions? How do we fund the get the amount of money needed to fund the SDGs? We always hear of that financing gap. So really the $1 billion or $1 trillion question. I'll let Eleni go first. Maybe just 1 or 2 minutes on these, so we can kind of keep the pace moving, though, with lots of good questions and lots of very smart panelists.
Okay. Thank you very much. So I think the most important thing is to build on strong evidence showing that what really works in the environment and how, right, so that we can learn from each other. But lack of evidence is not the only challenge in the sector, right? So if you look at, for instance, some of the countries in sub-Saharan African countries, investors are reserved to invest because, let's say, the legal environment is not as such strong and clear in some of the aspects. For instance, if I can use my own country, for many investors, in Ethiopia, the exit strategy is not really clear, right? So investors are afraid that, if you put in the money, you don't know how to take it out when you want. And, it's somehow both at macro and meso level, there are different factors. And there are, different things that should be addressed by policymakers, even with within the private sector, with their association, and from the investor side as well. A simple example would be, setting, for instance, the M&E, the monitoring and evaluation framework at the beginning, and being clear on what you want to achieve in terms of social development from your investment should be clear from the beginning, from both the investor and the investee. And as I said, at macro level, policymakers should make the investment environment conducive, so that we can build, the confidence of the investors, to take such risk, higher risk, but with a sustainable long-term impact. So I believe, there are different factors who are playing or who are that are hindering the development of the sector. And every actor has its own role to play, to promote the sector, so that we can contribute to achievement of SDGs and other development goals.
Yep, that's really important to have that functioning ecosystem and environment. Does anyone else want to jump in with a hot pursuit on how do we increase the quantum of investment into this space? Soren.
Just a reflection on that. So the journey from billions to trillions, in a way, is the journey of private enterprises in emerging and frontier markets, going from being supported by governments, donor agencies, and DFIs, which are necessarily in the billions category, to being served financially by the private market, like we know from the developed part of the world, and having the ability to transition the economies into a more sustainable way of operating, financed mostly by the private sector. And just linking to what we are discussing today, the more that we can have similar ways of thinking about impact and talking about and measuring impact in the domain of the billions, so governments, DFIs, and so on, and in the domain of the private sector, the easier it's going to be for private enterprises to make the journey from one domain to the other, from the billions domain to the trillions domain. We have a lot of work to do there, but no enterprise is going to make that journey without several handovers in terms of financing sources and ownership and so on. So the more seamless we can make that, the faster things are going to go. And then finally, maybe just a reflection on impact measurement and disclosures and then COVID. We've seen that there's a surprising quality or resilience in private enterprises that have been extensively assessed in terms of, from an impact perspective, from an ESG perspective. They simply do better, whether they are private or whether they, and I saw Matt had a question about also public corporations, publicly traded corporations, how they've done better in the crisis. It really stands to reason that if you have quality in assets that we as DFIs are working to get off the ground, then they are more resilient and have a better chance of graduating.
Go ahead, Howard.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So many of us speakers have more background in this than I do, so what I'm saying may just be, well, duh, yeah, we all know that. But the way I formulated at the beginning, my opening remarks about the distinction between impact investing and the impact of private sector investment seems to be a false dichotomy in what we're saying, because really you have more of a spectrum where you have investments whose have an explicit intention of being impact investment, and other private sector investments whose may not have a social orientation aspect to their investments at all, but could potentially do so. And clearly what's just been said is you lever the trillions by getting the private sector investment in general, all of foreign direct investment and so on, into your camp, rather than trying to expand your camp of impact investors. And so what the impact investment movement should be doing is not thinking about how they grow their camp, but how they actually get everyone else to be more aligned to your way of thinking. And there's two parts of that. So one is the advocacy part, why should you do this? And there's both a normative and a positive argument to that. So on the normative front, it's a good thing to do, but on the positive front, it's the statement I think Soren made earlier, someone made, that only investments that actually have a social return end up in the end are sustainable and have a long run private return. If that's really true, and we can really demonstrate that, then case made. Yes, I'm going to go and do a private. It's why, why Rowntree or Cadbury started building housing and schools back in the Midlands and the UK during the Industrial Revolution. It was precisely that argument. So if it's genuinely true, then that's the case you need to be making. And then the sort of framework that's been discussed by Elaine and Kelly and so on, and how you then measure that impact, that's necessary. That's the sort of tools you have to do this. But that's not, that's the other thing you're doing, is providing the tools to do this. But the advocacy part of getting large-scale private sector investors who just see their role as being private sector investors to have this impact investing mind frame when they do that work is the big win. And I guess you're doing that anyway. It's your day job is. So I'm really interested to hear how that part of it is going.
Go ahead, Kelly.
Really quick. I mean, Eleni, what you were saying really resonates with me in terms of there's a field building orientation that is absolutely still very, very necessary to address this particular issue. So, commitment to that. And I think the point about multiple levers, one of the levers, there are multiple levers to address this particular issue, and all of them are equally needed. The one that I think we haven't spoken about that's important from my perspective is to, integrating impact and impact evaluations, and all of this work that we've been talking about has largely existed in the space of sort of bespoke to the particular investment or bespoke to the particular investor. And if you look at, and I know some people love or hate using financial infrastructure analogs, I think they're useful. If you look at the financial infrastructure analog here, the only way that efficiency happened was to get to a common and universal understanding of financial information, imperfect as it is. And so one of the things I think that's really important here is to think about how we move to a more accessible, universal, and understandable way of accessing impact information, and get it out of its sort of silos of bespoke approaches. And the thing I'll point out on that is, one of the things I think is really important and exciting, and I see it sort of coming down the pipeline, probably within the next year or so, are more and more benchmarks on impact information, and those for and on private investment activity. And I think that's going to be sort of game-changing for all of this, to really start to help ease, I think, some of the risk concerns, and to start showcasing, as Soren mentioned, there's just not enough examples of what is working to sort of help capital flow efficiently towards what is working. And there's not a lot of examples about, like, where is the bar? And so I think that is one area that I think will be really exciting for this work coming down.
Definitely looking forward to those benchmarks to make my life easier. Emmanuel, I think, wanted to have a word.
Yeah, thanks. I actually had a question, John, if you don't mind, to Soren, Richard, and Kelly. And I think some of you mentioned that you see now a sea change in which there's a lot of interest in the firms in not just being measured by their finances, but how they meet environmental and social goals. They come to you and make their pitch on that. Is that because they think they can get your money more easily? Or is it because and why is it that they're interested in these longer term goals? I just want to get a sense of, why do you think that has changed? The other is a question that I had is, do you think that if these companies and firms learn lessons about how they're able to not just make more money, but also meet environmental and social goals more easily, that they're willing to share that with the rest of the world, so that it's not proprietary? Because that could be a concern if knowledge is still being kept privately. So I just wondered, if you don't mind, Sean, if there's more, these are a couple of questions that I thought that piqued my interest.
No, of course, doing my job for me is always welcome. Thank you. So Richard, I think wanted to have a word.
Yeah, maybe I could come in and then, sorry, you please compliment after me. On the first question, I guess, Emmanuel, it's a really interesting one. But I think one of the things I would say is almost, it's a little bit building on what Soren was saying before, which we would agree, is that there is a growing acknowledgement that where these kind of matters are at the core of your business plan and your business case, that this is a net positive and means your business case and your business plan is and you have a stronger business, right? So they are seeing this as in an entirely virtuous way, that this is a good thing for their bottom line. Firstly, I think is important. I think the second thing is yes, they're becoming quite sophisticated and identifying different pots of money and different actors who are able to fund them, and they are being better at marketing what they're doing in terms that makes it attractive for people like us. But then this comes back to Kelly's point that she was talking about before, that it is super, super important that we're able to have these benchmarks and to better compare the impacts of individual operations even, but the types of intervention that we're doing, so that our scarce resource, so the scarce capital resource that our stakeholders have given the EIB and the European Development Finance institutions, can be utilized in the most efficient way and to deliver the most impact. So this is why, the discussion that we're having is so important, that we can bring this loop closer together, so that we have capital constraints. So we have shareholders who don't have infinite resources, and they want us to utilize our resources in the most impactful and the most efficient way possible. So this is why it really is vitally important that the work that's being done by actors, by Kelly, by Howard, by all of you, is fed into how we operate. It's crucial.
Yeah, Soren, did you have a follow-up on that?
Just quickly, I mean, I very much agree that many firms are getting more sophisticated in what they're able to provide as part of their investment perspectives on the impact side. But we have to be a bit modest as DFIs and impact investors, and also recognize that we didn't do the best job giving or offering incentives to firms to do that in a strong way for a long time when we were experimenting ourselves. The fact that we are able to provide much more standardized data requests to clients or prospective clients means that in a way investors and companies in the markets can train together on these impact or ESG side data sets, and the more standardized data we can work with as investors, the easier it will be for firms to get a handle on it and not have to, in a sense, reinvent the data for every pitch that they have to make, because everybody's talking about impact in different ways.
Did anyone else have a follow-up on that one? Otherwise,
I guess no one answered the much more difficult second question that Emmanuel asked, and I see it also a little bit in the chat, and that is a much tougher question to answer, because we are still dealing with companies that are driven still to a great extent by looking for a competitive advantage and have still a profit motivation, and that's not a bad thing, right? That is, we want this, and we want to foster this, and we're happy to support those companies. So finding the mechanism whereby the positive lessons learned and the positive information can be shared in a transparent way, that is data that is neutral. I understand. It's difficult. It's difficult, and I'm not sure right now we have the answer. Maybe Kelly is the right person to answer on that. But it's a super tough one.
Maybe Sean, I'll say just a couple of things on this. mean, I do not have the silver bullet for everyone, so I'll start there. But I think, so a couple of things. I think that the point about competitive advantage is absolutely right. But I think what we're hearing here is the beginnings of an acknowledgement that we are seeing the competitiveness. Soren, you talked about the resilience of some of these companies just time and time again, especially when we're looking at the vulnerabilities exposed by COVID, just as an example, the resilience that these types of companies show. And we're also, looking at, companies and investors that really incorporate ESG into their factoring, absolutely have been outperforming your traditional investment approach. So what we're seeing here, I think, is the sort of, what I'll just call like the beginning echoes of an acknowledgement that these two things equal competitive advantage. So now what follows? What follows is, the other gaps. The discussion about, access to data and will people, will these companies be willing to give up that data? Well, the thing is that we have two pressure points coming together. One is sort of just this minimum baseline expectation that I was talking about earlier, where it's just no longer acceptable to not be transparent about basic ESG issues. And those things are absolutely being pushed into regulatory types of discussions about disclosures. And that's not just public companies, that is private companies. So we will see that. We will see that starting to unfold. So now you have the floor moving up. So where does the competitive edge go then? Well, you have to show your performance. You can't just, you can't just tell a story. Performance information is, what folks need to actually make decisions. And so one of the things that we're seeing at the GIN, we of course focus on the investment side, but through, private investors who are amassing good quality data from the companies in which they invest, are absolutely committed to this idea, not even the idea, but the promise that benchmarks and better analytics and more trusted information can actually help them make better decisions. So you have this, sort of trifecta of activity coming together, rewarding transparency and rewarding performance on that front. And so I'm, maybe this is Pollyanna-ish or, naive or just, too optimistic, but I actually see that convergence playing out in really positive ways for driving, to the point of, will companies share that information? I think they will be compelled to have to, because it is competitive. And then there is a minimum floor expectation. And so what our job is to demand it, all of us, to demand it and not create excuses anymore for it being hard because there is no excuse anymore. And then for organizations like ours and the others that are doing infrastructure work to just sprint as fast as we can to build out the capacity to make this simple, accessible, and not let, there's a perfection problem. I totally acknowledge it, but there is a point at which we have to just start somewhere. So, I mean, that's sort of my philosophy on this front.
And I've actually been told that we do sadly need to wrap it up, and this was such a good session. We could have gone for another hour. Happy to leave it on that optimistic note. I'm not sure we solved all the problems in the sector, but I think we came very close. So thank you so much, Lania, Richard, Kelly, Howard, Soren, and Emmanuel. Great session. Thank you to the organizers and to everyone who watched. I'm told to tell you there's a 15-minute break now before the next session, so you have a little bit of a chance to rest and grab a coffee or something else if it's not morning where you are. Thanks again, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Enjoy the conference.
Thank you very much. Thanks, John.